Welcome back, everybody. Here we are for the second section of artists classified as post-impressionists. So again, the post just means after, so it's not a very descriptive term. It doesn't tell you what the style looks like, and that's because each individual sort of pursued his or her own methods. But generally, most post-impressionists emphasize color and the connection between color and emotion. And then, of course, they each have individual specific characteristics. So we're going to look today at Toulouse-Lautrec and then at the Nabi Brotherhood. Now, Nabi comes from the Hebrew word Navi, which means prophets. And the Nabi Brotherhood kind of believed, in a sense, that their artwork made them sort of prophets of a new way of making art. We know that the painters of the Nabi Brotherhood had cameras. By the time they began to paint quite seriously, the late 1880s into the early 1890s, cameras were becoming more and more available, and in fact, you could even buy the equipment. It wasn't terribly expensive to be able to set up a darkroom in your own home. And we know that Bonnard and Vuillard, who were the leaders of the Nabi Brotherhood, took quite a number of photographs and used them as reference in their work. But they both used the camera as a way to help them frame compositions and to find interesting patterns and textures. And then in the paintings, they really used that as a jumping off point for making work that became more and more abstract. So they were sort of the prophets of a new way of thinking about art and the connection between art and emotion, between man and nature. They definitely were a subgroup within the Impressionists who had some related ideas in terms of their styles being similar one to the other. Again, we can't overemphasize the impact of these newly available in the West Japanese prints. Japan had been shut off from contact with Western traders really until the 1880s. And as Japan became more open, more available, it was not unusual for people who were importing goods, particularly Japanese pottery. We saw a big interest in that in the previous lecture. We also can see that sometimes the Japanese pots would be wrapped with the proofs or the not quite so perfect prints that printmakers would make and then discard. So these images were becoming more and more available to Western artists. They were a new and fresh, unique way of looking at the world from a slightly different point of view. You've certainly seen that image of the wave at the lower left plenty of times in your lives at this point, I'm sure. Hokusai is the Japanese woodcut master who is the author of these pieces. And you can see that they have a simplicity, they have a level of movement, large areas of negative space. Generally speaking, we tend to be looking down in on them, as we saw kind of the points of view in the works of Degas and of Cassatt. We're also going to see that continuing here with the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, Lautrec is a remarkable painter in a lot of ways. He paints the world that he is most familiar with, and that is really a world of nightlife. This is another Moulin. This is Moulin Rouge. Now, you may be familiar with the Nicole Kidman, Ewan McGregor movie Moulin Rouge, and it was a real place. It means the Red Windmill, and that was the architectural feature of this cabaret and nightclub. When you're looking at this image, may feel as though you're looking at wealthy aristocrats. You see men in top hats and women in beautiful gowns, but try to erase the top hats and suits as signs of wealth and just think of those as the clothing that most people wore at the time. It's slightly dressy, certainly, but you're also, if you think about it, most people, when you are in a social situation in America, you're going to see people in jeans, people in khakis. There's kind of a typical way of dressing that we associate with everyday streetwear. If you imagine these people as wearing slightly fancier streetwear, as if they've dressed up a bit to go out, then you're starting to see them more for what they are. We are actually in a nightclub. You can see a bottle of absinthe there on the table. toward the left-hand side, these are people who are enjoying a lot of what the cabaret has to offer, not just the food, the alcohol, the hallucinogenic effect of the absinthe, but the figure over here, this woman exposing quite a bit of her back in this dress, very thin, is most likely one of the performers in the cabaret. There was a woman who was a comedian who went by the stage name The Glutton, which implied that she overate and was very heavy. Obviously, she's rather thin. She was kind of like a Lucille Ball character, bawdy physical comedy. So what you're seeing here, if you think about it the right way, is counterculture. These are people who are going to a kind of hip, sort of dangerous, kind of underground type of a club. You could almost imagine them as club kids. You could imagine them as counterculture. Not even hipster is not really the right word, but these are people who are at the cutting edge of what the new trends in fashion and music and entertainment are going to all be about. They're wearing extreme makeup, they're interested in stage effects, they're interested in enjoyment and pleasure and expanding their minds to some extent, perhaps even with the extensive use of the hallucinogenic alcohol that is absinthe. The figure at the far right is up pretty dramatically, and that throws a pretty intense shadow on her face, but that kind of acid green and stark white almost gives her the effect of a mask. You get a feeling that things are a little off kilter in this scene. We're actually seated on the other side of this balustrade, so we're probably at a table over on the left-hand side looking over this railing at other patrons in the Moulin Rouge. This is definitely different from the Moulin de la Galette. It's not as elegant. It's a little more in your face, a little more dangerous. And Toulouse-Lautrec, I think, would have loved that interpretation. He was a unique individual. He broke his left leg when he was 12 years old, and then broke his right leg when he was 14, and they didn't heal properly. They never actually grew properly after that. So he ended up, although born a typical type of baby, a normal stature would have been, normal height would have been what was expected. Because his legs didn't grow, he ended up being much, much shorter than he should have been. So not truly what we would today call a little person, but he really was quite short. You can see that in photographs of him as well. His nickname among the ladies was the Little Teapot. So I'll leave that to your imagination why they might have called him that particular name. But we know that he was very much interested in the pleasures of being alive. We definitely see him advertising these pleasures in the work that he did to promote places like the Moulin Rouge. And so here you see him showing through prints that he designed and made. These are lithographs, and they show you the cabaret acts and the people enjoying them. The kind of thing you could enjoy at a place like the Moulin Rouge. The idea of lithography is really kind of an interesting print. It's done on limestone, but you don't have to carve or scratch or harm the surface in any way. The limestone is left as a flat, thick rectangle. A drawing is made on top of the stone surface in a material that's very greasy. So you can imagine like a crayon, usually black, but very, very greasy to the touch. And strangely, anything greasy, even the oil in your own skin, would start to eat away at the surface of the limestone. But you wouldn't be able to see it with your naked eye or feel it by touch. It happens on a microscopic level. But basically anywhere that there's any grease starts to eat away at the stone, providing like a little reservoir or a well that ink will then stick to. So if you keep the stone wet and roll oil-based ink onto it, magically the oil-based ink won't go where the water is. The water won't go where the greasy drawing was, leaving holes for where the ink can go. So lithography became by far the fastest, most convenient, dominant way to make printed images for all kinds of purposes, but especially for posters. It was used quite often in the printing of maps, even in the printing of money, believe it or not. So lithography is a very versatile technique. I mean, this looks like a drawing that's been filled in with some watercolor. right? But it's a print. It's very versatile kind of technique. You can make a lithograph look like charcoal, you can make it look like a pen and ink drawing, you can make it look like a painting to an extent. So it's a very, very versatile print technique, and Toulouse-Lautrec was clearly a master of its use. There's a photo of Toulouse, and you can see how much shorter than normal his legs are in that photograph. Gives you a little sense of what he was like as an individual. This is the work of Pierre Bonnard, one of the founders of the Nabi Brotherhood. So another artist who initially set out to be a lawyer and then changed his path. This clearly is a landscape, but it's a much more abstract landscape than any that we've seen by any of the other artists up to this point. Often when I look at the paintings of the Nabi Brotherhood, I think about how much these look like textiles, like a flat surface with pattern and texture all over. And I really think that was part of their goal, was to really increase the abstract nature of what they were presenting to you as a visual piece of art. It goes further down the road of abstraction than any of the other post-impressionist styles that we've looked at up to this point. Bonnard is perhaps best known for these rather unusual paintings, intense, rich colors, strange perspectives. For instance, this is meant to be a bathroom. At the far left-hand side, you can see a cloth of a bathtub. Here's the rim of the tub. This is a woman getting undressed, presumably to take a bath. She has her little dog with her. And obviously the tile in the floor in the bathroom would make sense since there's water everywhere. But notice how the tile runs straight up and down. It's not following the rules of perspective at all. The colors are kind of jumbled and intensified. Quite often, the Nabi can be described as using jewel-like colors, the colors of emeralds and sapphires, bright, intense. Also unusual perspectives that create more of a texture or pattern and make the images a little harder to decipher. The woman in the painting is standing upright, foot to her leg. You can see her arm, but she's bent at the waist. So what you're looking at here is actually the top of her head as she leans forward toward us. It's a very unusual kind of position, and it creates a deep sense of abstraction, and again allows him to emphasize the pattern in the painting overall. Vuillard is another founding member of the Nabi. He and Bonnard shared the studio for a while. An interesting note about Vuillard is that he lived with Mother until her death. So a lot of his paintings are of interiors. And those interiors are often loaded with texture and pattern from wallpaper and the clothing of the people in the rooms. They're really kind of remarkable. This is the one to know for the test. It's my personal favorite of his. It is a little hard to interpret what's going on at first glance. There's so many little dots and squids in the paint that it might not immediately look like an interior, but in fact we're inside of a room. There are two women in the room. The main figure here is pretty easy to identify. Her partner is over here, kind of leaning outside the window, perhaps shaking out some fabric to get some dirt off of it, perhaps. I'm not really sure. And then there's this figure here that at first looks like a little squiggle of black paint, but is actually a man who's entering the room, but it seems like he's coming out of the wallpaper, doesn't it? What you're actually seeing here is the back of the door, and that door has wallpaper on it. It's the same as the wallpaper here, but it's a dark value because there's a shadow on the door as it is being closed off from the light that's coming through the window that this woman is leaning out of. The pattern out here is most likely flowering plants, like a tree with blooms on it. Notice how the wallpaper changes as we see it through the glass. She's opened the window, the glass of the window folds into the room, opposed to opening the window outside. And so we see the pattern of the wallpaper through glass here, as opposed to how it looks here, as opposed to how it looks here behind the door in the shadow. So it's an odd arrangement of textures and patterns that it takes a minute to break down. Remember again that these are artists who did have cameras. They used the cameras to find these vignettes and then to emphasize their abstraction.